All right, hang on here. Start my video. There we go. Hang on a sec.
All right, here we go.
Again, these flashes.
Yeah, well, now
Dramatic
I believe we are live.
Fabulous.
All
Thank
right. Welcome, Bryan Reesman.
you very much.
Been excited to have you on since I started this. We've been friends a long time.
Going back, I think to 98. Let me grab my drink here. Hang on.
Oh, okay. Yeah, 98. Definitely around then, for sure.
I think you were at
Um,
Roadrunner at that point, and I was still in Boston, and I was moving to New York that summer, moving back.
yep, yep. Ah, Ken is
Product
watching.
endorsement.
Hello, Ken. Um,
Hello, Ken. Goth Ken.
well, Brian, why don't you tell us about how you started in journalism?
God, the Cliff's Notes, the Brian's Notes version. Went to film school, then went out to LA for a couple of years, worked in the industry, and I kind of wasn't sure quite what I wanted to do. And at the time, I'd worked at a music store for a little while and got to learn about promos and making relationships, developing relationships with publicists. Started writing for Music Fanzine by the mid '90s. Started writing for like Alternative Press and Keyboard, Boston Phoenix. And I just saved some money back home, and then '98 came back to New York, and then it went from music to adding on home video and movies and Broadway shows and comic books. And it's kind of literally just, I feel like I'm an octopus. I have 8 different tentacles and I'm always going out and trying to find different stuff. So it keeps my career going, although sometimes certain people know me for different things. I'm the metal guy for some people, and then I'm like the horror movie guy for other people. It's interesting. And I've been doing it for 26 years now, professionally.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, that's the quick version. I mean, it built up over time, like you did with publicity. You start at one gig, and then it gets you work somewhere else, and then maybe one editor leaves somewhere, and you go somewhere else, or that editor goes to a different place and gives you work. And I just to keep my career going, I embrace different things, but I love different things. So I'm not just a rock guy. I love movies. Broadway was something I never thought I would cover. Those 2 columns fell into my lap, literally. Like, we have a
Well,
professional person that can't do it, so can you do it?
yeah, I mean it's not like a mystery why things quote unquote fall into your lap because you're very good at what you do and you're very
Thank you.
well researched. So,
Well, but I'll tell you, I was thinking about something today. I remember my first ever sound column, I think it was for FOH, and this is 2004. And I had to cover Wicked. I had not seen Wicked, and they needed the column in 3 days. So I had to call the sound designer, and I had not seen the show. And this is like a Tony Award winning sound designer, but he was actually very cool about it. I explained, look, I'm replacing this guy. Can you help me out? And he was very good about it, actually. It was great. But sometimes, you don't want to be doing that. You really don't want to be going in interviews where you don't know. At least I understood sound design. I just hadn't seen the show. So he filled in the cracks for me, and it worked.
yeah, well you're not a person that wings it often. I know that you do extensive research after, you've interviewed a lot of my clients.
Yeah,
And we
and you
were
listen.
talking before about relationships and you had an interesting take on the whole thing and I would love for you to share it.
About just the relationship between writers and publicists.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we've talked about before, and I've seen this, like I'm in music journalists and publicity, groups on Facebook, and you talk to people. Like I had a great conversation with Alex Greenberg a couple weeks ago because I said, we haven't spoken on the phone in a couple of years. And actually, the last time I saw her was a year. I thought it was actually it was over 2 years ago because I was starting my podcast. And speaking of relationships, like I'd interviewed Jean-Michel Jarre, who's a famous electronic music composer that I interviewed him 3 times before. And I wanted to get him on my podcast. I didn't actually have the podcast. I had the title, Side Jams, and I had the concept. I'd done one interview. And I said, he's coming into town. Could I interview him? And they agreed. But that's because she knew me. He knew me. They liked me. And that got me the access. I think if I tried doing this podcast 10 years ago, it might not have been the same thing. It's the same thing with you, with Aaron Bruno from AOL Nation, where I did a great Grammy piece on him. And since the press hasn't always been nice to him, he's like, all right, I'll do his podcast. And you also finesse that too. I mean, it's partially the publicist going to the client saying, yeah, this is maybe as big as like doing Grammy, but this will be worth your time.
Yeah.
Um,
There are
and I
things
feel
that
like,
are worthwhile that aren't huge. So.
Yeah, and it really comes down to that. Like Alex and I were talking about the fact that, in the business over time, you develop these relationships with people. I don't know if people today are doing the same thing. Younger people coming up as journos or as publicists are handling the same thing. There's a bit more of a corporate edict these days to just kind of push for the publicity you need and not worry about everything else. But the relationships do matter. It matters if you want to hook someone up with the right writer and not have any problems. And it matters if, I have a publicist who can help me out with something where maybe it's not, maybe the late, it's kind of like the way I look at my podcast is like at least a third of the 33 episodes, I just contacted the artist directly. I already knew them and I said, can you do this? They said, yes. And then the next third are publicists who the artist already knows me through them. And they're like, yeah, okay. And then maybe the last 30 have to work a little bit more towards because they, if I can piggyback it onto another interview, like I've done that where I interview Serge Tankian and Fleur Jansen for Grammy or Billboard, and then they piggyback on the podcast interview, then it just works out time-wise. But there's still a lot of the podcasts come through relationships. It's not like I just told people I have a podcast. The first 6 or 7 episodes, I didn't have it yet. But the publicist and the artist like, yeah, we'll do it.
Do you think technology affects it? I mean, because now there's more email, there's more texting, there's less personal contact. Like when I was looking to hire somebody years ago, I wouldn't hire somebody who wouldn't get on the phone.
It's interesting you talk about phone calls. I don't get that many phone calls anymore. I really, really don't. I get a lot of, I get a lot of emails. I probably get 150 PR emails a day. I get inundated and I cannot answer them all clearly.
No.
And this is the tricky part, again, about relationships. You're going to respond first to people you know better, or if it's an artist or something you really want to cover, that's where you're going to go to first. But yeah, there's a lot of people who don't really introduce themselves the right way. You get an email, and then maybe 2 days later, you get a follow-up email forwarding the old email saying, have you checked this out? Then you get a third email a week later following up the second email that forwarded the first email. And I sit there going, I get it. And if it's something I really want to cover or interested in, I'll contact them. By the same token, you have to start building those relationships. When I came to New York, you wanted to meet me when I was living in Boston, but I think I just come back from a press trip to Phoenix and it was a blizzard. And I hadn't slept in 20 hours. I'm like, it's probably not a good time to meet right now. But as soon as I got to New York, we met. You took me out to a lot of parties. I was new to the city and you were cool about, people knew who I was kind of, but there's some people that didn't. So you made sure I met all these different publicists and editors and you were cool about that. That's how it works.
Yeah. And we had our birthday parties together most years. So
we were close and we had a lot of the same friends and we met friends through each other. Nowadays before COVID, my birthday party this past year was evidently the last big party a lot of my friends went to. I think Ken said that. Sorry about that. Don't maybe avoid the next one just in case. So skip a year just in case we don't have any more problems. No, but I've learned to do that. I learned that, you also have events where you get people together. And I think now when people come to my birthday, it's not really just for my birthday. It's just they know they're going to meet interesting people showing up.
Yeah.
And I learned that over the years. When I was living in Boston, I would take like a week-long trip to LA or a week-long trip to LA, then a week in San Francisco. And I would purposely go around and introduce myself to people. And I found out that many writers didn't do this, especially with home video. I remember like 15 years ago, I would just go see all the publicists. They would also give me a lot of free crap. So I'd FedEx home about 3 boxes full of DVDs and Blu-rays for myself, half of which I still haven't watched. And I would make the rounds and introduce myself. And you kind of find out what level of respect you're getting. I remember it was Tom Chen, who now works at Shout Factory. He arranged a meeting for me when he was at NPRM. And I was 10 minutes late because it's LA. And being New York, I always forget. I have to plan out. And I didn't realize he was going to have every freaking publicist in that firm. It was like 15 people in a room looking at me when I came in.
Oh.
But that was great because I met 15 publicists at once. I got to pitch myself. And I think a lot of writers don't realize that you really do need to go and meet people. I don't know that it's as common anymore. I don't think I haven't been to many major labels anymore, but I used to go in, I would have lunch meetings. It was a working vacation. I would have a lunch meeting, I'd have a dinner meeting, I'd have drinks. Also a great way to get free meals. And it's the excuse for people to get out of the office and take you to lunch. Oh, I got to meet with the writer, so I'm going to be gone for a couple hours. Yeah. And you have to do that. You have to press the flesh. You've got to talk to people. And publicists, I think, also need to get to know the writers.
100%. You need to get to know what they like, what angles work best for them. Yep. And especially a freelancer like yourself, who then once I pitch you, you have to go pitch the editors. So it's a lot of effort on your part. So we got to do our homework.
It's a whole process. That's gotten trickier for freelancers, admittedly, in the last few years. I think 10, 15 years ago, like 15 years ago, you could pitch somebody really pre-internet. I mean, the internet was growing, but I think by 2010, every magazine had their internet version. And so you could just say, oh, the new Godsmack record's coming out, the new Bjork record's coming out. Great, we'll do something on it. Then it became, because the freelance budget started to shrink a bit and they were dealing with the online world cutting into print sales, and print magazines still pay better than online outlets. It's just the way it is.
Oh yeah.
They had to justify the freelance. And it's not my editors being mean, it's that they're given a budget. This is the edict now. You can only spend this much. So if you're going to pay for this, we need to make sure it's an interesting concept. And I'd heard that about talk shows actually many years ago, that now it wasn't just a guest coming on the show anymore, that they had to help, their handlers had to help come up with a cool sketch idea for the show. Like it just became, everything became much more concept driven. And then of course the clickbait things comes into play. I've had a few times where editors changed my headline a bit to make it more clickbaity, which can get you in a little bit of trouble, which publicists don't always realize. Well. Yes, I mean, this is the thing. So I think you've established enough to know that the writer has to go through a process to pitch the editor. Sometimes I think a lot of publicists now skip the freelancer and go to the editor because, okay, the editorial person has more power. But if the editor doesn't really know the genre or the artist that well, and they have a freelancer that does, it's still better to give it to the freelancer. I've read stories sometimes where it was a good story, but clearly the person didn't really know the artist that well. And if they'd given it to somebody that I knew, not even just me, to somebody else, it probably would have been a better story. Because that's what everybody wants. And your clients deal with the same BS questions every time. And after a while, they roll their eyes. And you were listening in. Like I purposely make sure that I have some unusual questions ready to go. I remember I was on the red carpet for the Monty Python premiere of their documentary at the Ziegfeld 12 years ago. And I only had 3 or 4 minutes to teach them. I got all of them except Eric Idle, but I made sure I asked each of them a non-Monty Python question first. So I talked to Terry Jones about his books, Terry Gilliam about his unfinished, Man of La Mancha movie. I talked to John Cleese about what play he'd like to be in, and Michael Palin, all his different TV shows traveling the world. And they appreciated that. They're like, oh, this guy's not an idiot. He's not going to say,
you did your
what's
homework.
your favorite Monty Python sketch, And I think that's the key thing is being able to come to the table with interesting questions. Sometimes you can't, sometimes you just think you've got great questions and like they've been asked. You got them late enough in the cycle that there's nothing else to ask, but I don't know. I mean, I can't really say. I mean, you've listened to some of my interviews. Sometimes I can't always say what it is that I'm doing. It's just instinctual.
Yeah. Well, you're also very respectful. So that, you respect the time you're getting from someone, and, I respect the effort that goes into, you bringing something over the line to get it done.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
oh yeah, no, I'm just saying, like, uh, that's a lot of work, and a lot of work that people don't consider sometimes.
I don't think a lot of it's weird, even though I don't have a journalism degree, I have a film school degree. It's interesting when I've gone to junkets about 6 to 10 years ago, I was doing a lot of Universal hired me for 4 or 5 years to do these generic press junkets. So I would do interviews with like people like Hugh Jackman, Mark Wahlberg. They wouldn't show my face, but I kept all the footage so I could make my own reel. I copied it before I sent it to them because I'm not dumb. And some people wouldn't actually. People who were professionals were doing that. And so I had to come up with questions that they would use overseas for the UK division for home video. And I'd always try to make sure I asked interesting questions. And I only had 4 to 5 minutes. But I remember once I had to interview Ben Foster, who was in Contraband with Mark Wahlberg. And, I got a double slot because they needed the video press for the UK and Europe. And people were coming out saying, oh, this guy's just not having anything to talk about. And I made sure, like, one of the questions I asked him was about transcendental meditation. And I'd interviewed David Lynch. And the very last question I asked David Lynch once was about transcendental meditation. And David Lynch, who was like a mellow guy, suddenly, for a guy into meditation, was getting all excited and like really loud.
Foundation, right?
Wow. And so Ben Foster, a quarter of the time, we talked about transcendental meditation. And I remember somebody who had to edit my videos in the UK emailed me and said, I just want to let you know that I really like your interviews. Like, you try to, even if you ask a regular question, you try to word it differently. I'm like, yeah, how hard is it to do that? But some of the young journalists I would see at those junkets, I don't even think they spent more than an hour looking at their IMDb credits and the basic thing. It's like, it's not that hard. You don't have to be an expert on anybody to actually sit down and know them. You get to know them. And sometimes also you just bond. I mean, in-person interviews are better for that.
Absolutely. Darren Paltrowitz wants to know who you think was the best lead singer of Van Halen.
You know what? I
Friends are
love both
silly.
Dave. I love both Dave and Sammy, but Dave was the quintessential, not because he was the better singer, but because it was overall the better front man. But I do love, and his stuff was less pop. But I do love Sammy Hagar, but I think I love Sammy Hagar more for his solo stuff, actually.
Oh,
But I can see
well.
why people went for it. I almost had a DLR interview that got canceled,
Oh,
and
yeah?
that was yeah. And if you want to talk about doing your research and then not having it pay off, I was
Mm.
supposed to do a cover story for Goldmine, and he was doing this acoustic tour for that really bizarre No Holds Barbecue video he did. And so it was a Saturday night. I had to push off going out with somebody. And then the call doesn't happen. And I'd spent many, many hours listening to Van Halen albums, bootlegs, doing all the research. And I'm like, oh man, what am I going to do now? And so my friend Gail Flug, did a lot of journalism in the
Yeah.
80s, 90s, the aughts, she said to me, interview people work with him. It's like, oh, yeah. So I got Billy Sheehan. I got Steve Vai, and Steve Vai talked about it because I interviewed him for a Goldmine cover. I
Wow.
got his current drummer, who went on to Korn. I got a couple journalists who'd been backstage, and I got a cover story. And so I saved several $100s of income by trying to be inventive, but sometimes it doesn't always work. And that's the other thing that I think is tricky to deal with, I'm sure, in terms of writers and publicists, when things go wrong. And how do
Yeah.
you handle that? That's something that you and I don't think have had to deal with very much, though.
Well, I mean, I do, not with you, but I have dealt with it, and you know, it's interesting how other people handle it. Like when I've been at labels and hired indies,
Mhm.
how other people have tried to handle it, and then I step in and I'm like, all right, my relationship is with the journalist. The
Yeah.
artist, of course, is my responsibility, but I've known you longer than I've known some of the artists I've worked with.
Well,
So,
look, some of these things happen. I remember I chased a Tori Amos interview for 6 months back in '98 when she did the Choir
uh,
Girl Hotel album, and I was going to get a 4 or 5 page story and keyboard, and that was my editor said, "Oh, we're doing it." And then I got the interview. So it was 30 minutes. I think she actually had a pillow over her head while she did the phoner, which is hilarious. But she gave me this great interview. And then a new editor in chief got into keyboard, and then they had to cut it down to a page. And my editor, who had assigned it, had worked he told me, you can't cut this entirely. Like, this guy spent half a year chasing this interview. And I was bummed. I wasn't mad at my editor, but I was pissed. So I ended up going to Goldmine, and I sold the rest for a 2 page spread in Goldmine, which is an oversized magazine. So I got 2 stories out of it, basically made the same money. And the publicist, I think, was okay with it because I got the second assignment. But
well, you
sometimes,
made the extra effort,
some newer publicists might not understand that happens. It even happens with editors. They do this big interview, and then suddenly, if it's in a magazine, well, we had this other story come in, and this cover story now wiped this other story off the map. Or, I did an interview earlier this year. I did a thing on Rob Halford's autobiography, and I got him. But at the time, my editor at NBC said, why don't we do it during Pride Month, which is June? Because I have this feeling when it comes September, a lot of political stuff's going to come in that's just going to replace it. And we couldn't get him in June, but we got him in September. And I made the pitch hard enough. I said, look, this is the only major male metal singer to come out of the closet, like at that level. And
yeah.
they still did it. And it was a great story. But timing can be involved. Sometimes a publicist sets something up and it doesn't happen. And I get annoyed, but it's usually I know the publicist, it's like, it's fine. I mean, it's worse when someone cancels it on you, but they're not particularly apologetic. And you're like,
Yeah, I mean,
I don't get paid if there's no story.
yeah, exactly. Michelle is watching, and she asks which artist had the most awful or weird limitations on questions for an interview.
God.
Yeah, that's a head scratcher for sure.
I've actually been very lucky. Most people have not. Like, I remember I had to interview Vanessa Williams in person at her hotel, and they just said, don't ask about her divorce.
Oh,
And I was
well.
writing this for a magazine for Black teen girls because clearly I'm the man to be doing that. I got this too somehow through Hit Parader because I knew somebody there and they got me this magazine. I mean, I had somebody who said, I interviewed Lisa Gerard from Dead Can Dance for Mix and for like a goth zine, but she didn't like being associated with goths. So as long as I didn't talk about Dead Can Dance because it was a solo project or goth, it was okay. I was like, okay, whatever. And I had her on the phone for an hour.
But I feel
Um,
like restrictions like that are kind of strange. I mean, I talked to Catherine Turman last week about
yeah,
restrictions,
yeah.
and we were talking about her experience with the ACDC interview that she did. I mean,
Recap that for me, because I only know a little bit about that. I've been so buried in some stuff I've been doing.
well, Catherine had said, she had said something in a Facebook group that we were in
Mm,
about not wanting to be a shill for, companies, and
yeah.
I believe that the restriction was kind of unreasonable because
Right.
it applied to the theme of why she even wanted to interview them at all.
Okay.
I mean, I was likening it to what I do, and my Tommy Lee stuff. I mean, it made sense you couldn't ask about his ex-wives, but he didn't care if you asked about Motley Crue.
I don't, I've rarely had the restrictions in place for anything, mainly because I don't think yeah, I mean, I've learned that I think it depends if people have been burned by past journalists. So I remember I pitched Trent Reznor to a magazine. They're like, yeah, let's do it. This is when The Fragile came out.
Mhm.
And I went to the publicist, and the publicist said, well, basically that magazine and that writer, I think, were blacklisted because the writer had gone and done an interview with Trent before. And when I don't know if he still has his home studio in the funeral home in New Orleans, but he'd gone there. And at one point he asked Trent about his gear, and Trent said, okay, but this is just for you. Well, the writer evidently didn't keep it just for them, from what I understand. And that was what I heard. And so basically, I wasn't going to be able that. So even though I don't think it was the magazine's fault, it's still, people get kind of bummed about that stuff and go, oh, okay, that's not cool. Or you misquote somebody, or you find out that and this does happen occasionally, like you haven't, and I've rarely had that happen where like the editor really makes a clickbaity headline, or they edit it down and take out the heart of the piece and focus on what seems to be more controversial. And then you look bad because you didn't make that call. But again, I rarely have that happen. It seems like my editors trust me. I mean, something's always going to happen, but I think a lot of that has to do with trust, and knowing. And again, like I like the in-person interviews because you do get that sort of bonding thing. I remember I interviewed Amy Lee from Evanescence on this and on the Open Door, and that was way back in 2006. And so I met her at that place, Coffee Shop, that was in Union Square West,
Yeah.
the Celebrity Diner. She was the only person there. She'd been doing interviews all day with journalists, and they were just ordering Cokes. And finally, I got there at 5 p.m., and these people were really annoyed that she wasn't really buying any food. So they banished us to the back, and she was very cool about it. She's like, whatever. And we ordered drinks. They never came. And I'm just, and it kind of bonded us because we both been dissed. But she handled it really well. And then I talked about some personal stuff too, about my life and about my family. And then she opened up and told me about, she had a sister that when she was 6, her sister had died at age 3. And she told me this whole story that there's one song on each album about her dead sister. And later on, I talked to the publicist. I'm like, oh, I'm surprised she told me about that. They're like, yeah, we're surprised she told you about that too. And I realized it's because, she trusted me. And that's why in person is usually better.
Yeah.
And, we had this ridiculous experience where I was like, yeah, this coffee shop just blew off at that point one of the biggest rock singers in the world, because they were a little younger, had no clue who was there, because I guess they're used to actors or something.
Yeah.
It's really funny.
Yeah, that's very weird.
And
And
sometimes oh, good.
oh,
Yeah.
go ahead. Go ahead.
No, sometimes you just have these things that people remember. The first time I interviewed Rob Halford was a 3-hour interview where he test drove a Corvette. So he always remembered that. Because it was a fun interview. They only ran about a quarter of it. So when he saw it, I was like, yeah, I was hoping 6 pages, and they cut it to 4. But still, it was a fun interview. And sometimes when you have a great interview with somebody, I was interviewing Doro recently, and we'd done many interviews, but the one thing that we remembered was when we did a metal roundtable with a bunch of metal people in Germany that I arranged, because I arranged a trip 20 years ago for 4 record labels to send me around Germany for 10 days for like 4 different assignments, and they all paid for it. And she remembered that. So yeah, if you don't have the in-person, you got to do the phoner. I guess with Aaron Bruno, it was because, most people like to make fun, like people tend to make fun of him, or they're not big fans. So I knew that I was doing it for Grammy, and we wanted a good story. And I actually didn't really like his poppier stuff, and I admitted that, but I said, I like your deeper cuts. So I guess I got respect for that because I actually listened to the music.
You get respect because you actually listen.
What?
And the reason I like to listen to interviews, and sometimes people take offense to it, but I don't
Yeah,
know, not too many people take offense to it when I do it because they know why I do it. I do it
sure.
because I learn more about my artists through
Yeah,
interviews. I could ask them 100 times to tell me interesting things about them,
yeah,
and they
yeah.
won't remember things until they're in an interview.
Well, yeah, and sometimes, yeah, I mean, you have to learn to wing it sometimes. I actually do wing it. I mean, I remember once interviewed John Cusack, and I think it was supposed to be like 15 minutes, got down to 10, and then when I got to see him, it was 8. in
Oh,
person. It was 2012 because he was getting on a plane to go to Berlin. And I had 8 questions. I'm like, great, 8 questions, 8 minutes. 4 minutes in, he'd answered everything. And I was like, oh man. And I just had to improvise for the next 4 minutes. And one of the things I improvised is, by the way, did you see that video from the starting line from a few years ago? Because it's an homage to Say Anything. He's like, no, I didn't know about that. So we talked about how some younger fans were getting into him because of the 80s nostalgia that was going on. I'm like, whew, all right. I got just enough for my story. It lit on a tangent and we're good. And then conversely, I've had people, I interviewed Lana Parrilla from Once Upon a Time, the ABC show. She was the evil queen. And it was only for like 500 word story in American Way magazine. So the publicist patches us in from ABC and I'm talking to her and we keep talking because I'd done an interview with her before and she had done an interview with me on the phone right before she was about to go to her funeral. And I said to her, and she remembered because that was a good interview and I had no idea she was doing that. I'm like, really? You didn't say anything to me about this. Like I could have done it later. And she was very professional, did it. She remembered the interview, she liked it. And we kept talking and like an hour and a half goes by before we hang up. The publicist doesn't interject. And she realized that I was interested in her as an actor. And I don't know. And she was dropping off her dog at doggy daycare. I could hear it in the background. She's telling me about the man who became her future husband because she knew I wasn't going to print it. And I don't know. I've had that luck sometimes. I've had people, Azam Ali, when I interviewed her for Billboard on my podcast a couple of years ago, we chatted for like 3 hours. I don't know how that happens. I mean, people limit you these days. You have to put limits on things because you've got a lot of interviews to do. But
well,
sometimes
I've interrupted and been yelled at by my own artist.
That's never happened. I've had people say time's up. And I've been doing this long enough that I say, do you have a few more minutes? And they usually say, yeah, okay. And then what are they going to say at that point? No.
Well, I let it run like probably 20 to 30 minutes late. And then I was like, "Ooh, we have other things. We got to get to them." And
That I understand. Yeah.
and then my artist, and I don't even remember who it was, to be very honest. And they were
Yeah.
like, "I'll let you know when we're done." And I said, "Okay." Like, you know.
Well, it's a compliment to the writer that journalist that the person wants to speak to them. I think also you just end up bonding with people. I mean, I bonded with Ron, musician I became friends with, because we had a similar health crisis. It was like we had done his interview for something and we just started talking about what had happened to us. It was like, oh, you went through that too.
Mm.
Now, as I was telling you before we got on, it's like the thing about relationships in this business is to me, there's 3 levels of relationship. There's business friend, and then there's friend. You and I are friends.
Mhm.
Like I think I said before the interview that I'd called you up. I don't think I've talked about this on this, but I'd called you up. I think I just needed to get paid for a bio, and it wasn't like a big deal. And you weren't having a very good day, so I said, "All right, Jamie's not having a very good day. I'm not going to talk about this right now. Let's just talk about Jamie's bad day." And we talked about whatever. I cheered you up somehow. I don't even know what I said. I don't think I said anything.
You always do.
Well, that's good. And there's no therapy fee involved in that, by the way. So, and then that was it. Like, and then I emailed you 3 days later or something. But we're friends. Now there's business friends where it's sort of half and half, where you've gotten to know them enough over the years that they're going to take your call. They'll email you back even if they can't do it, or they'll try to help you. Like Ken Phillips is great with that. Like I might ask him for advice on something or say, do you have this contact? And he and I don't work together very often, but I think what he said to me once was that whenever we do work on something, it's great.
Mm-hmm.
So he remembers those things. I'm like, oh, that's cool. And then business is like, you have a relationship based on business and there's the respect, but they don't have the time, or you just haven't developed that connection. And it's not a bad thing. As long as you have the respect of people in the industry, that's, I think, what matters. Sometimes they go, oh, I wish I got into this outlet, or the podcast was doing a little bit better at the beginning, but people are like, well, people in the industry know you, so you're going to get the access to things. And I've realized that I've called in favors, but I haven't had to necessarily call in favors for the podcast because people just agree to do it.
Yeah.
And if I were younger and didn't have that, it would be different. Like people 2/3 of the time, 3/4 of the time, they don't ask me for numbers. Like, okay, we'll do it. Again, I piggyback it on some things sometimes, or they just know who I am. I think with Danny from Cradle to Filth, Debbie over at Adrenaline PR is like, yeah, you want to do this podcast with Brian? He's like, yeah, okay. And we get there, it's like, so what's this about? And I'm like,
right.
Well, we're going to talk about your hobbies. It's like, oh. And so we, in a minute or two, thought about it, and then we just chatted for 30 minutes, and it was a great interview.
Yeah.
But I've known him for 20 years. So
I know.
That
I
also,
remember when I was working him, you knew him. So
yeah, no, he was, and twice, he's funny because twice I've had to interview him in the dark because he was hungover. the first time he and Paul had come in and they had gone out drinking the night before, and it was literally a dark room, and I'm just asking questions and their heads are on the table like this, and they end up to answer a question and their head goes back on the table, and I was like, okay. And you know what? You have to wing it. You sometimes, you were talking about inappropriate interviews that have happened, but like I've had times where I just don't get time. I interviewed Dick Wolf when I was in Monte Carlo, literally walking 7 minutes from his panel to his limo, and that's all I got, and I got a half a page story out of it. I interviewed Steve Aoki for Playboy a couple years ago at Comic-Con, and they're like, okay, we're going to walk you from the booth to his MTV interview because that's all the time they had, and he gave me enough good stuff, and I was able to not do it as Q&A, but do it as a feature to fill in the cracks. So you have to be able to, as a journalist, you're going to have to be able to wing it sometimes. It's not always going to be the ideal situation. And sometimes you just have to go for it.
One thing I wanted to make sure I asked you,
Sure.
what do you wish that that publicists would do when they pitch you that you generally find they don't do?
Well, I mean, just sending me a press release probably isn't always going to work. I mean, once I had a bunch of people send me press releases about bands from New Zealand and Australia. It was like Gautier had been big at that point. So I just went to Grammy and said, there's this trend going on. They're like, okay. So I wrote the story out of it. None of those publicists had contacted me like saying, hey, Bryan, like you would do, like I have this really good idea. Here's an angle on it. I get so many press releases sometimes. And that thing of, if you don't know somebody and them following up, I mean, I appreciate persistence because I'm a persistent pain in the ass too about stuff. I mean, once really I've badgered a few people about getting interviews, and I did it. I call it being politely persistent. But you do, if you don't have a relationship with someone, then you try to develop it. Like I don't know. People don't do phone calls as much as they used to. But maybe it may be in an email, and I don't always get the chance to do this. But I'll say, I write for this person. By the way, if I don't know them that well, like, by the way, maybe I worked with you here, or I remember you worked at this other company, we haven't worked together. Or if it's an artist, I like, by the way, I interviewed them 2 or 3 times in the past, or like something happened, and I give them some familiarity with who I am, so at least they'll know who I am. And then, building the relationships isn't easy. There aren't the parties anymore. We don't have all these big industry parties that we used to have. You would go around at CMJ. I don't go to CMJ South by Southwest that much anymore. I guess we don't need to do that. But sometimes I feel like that's what I do with my birthday. I used to do monthly gatherings. Sometimes you just have to show up, even if you don't want to, because I went to a case in point. So I interviewed this woman, Natalie Gelman, for Billboard. I did a story since I wrote a book on Bon Jovi, I pitched them a story on people who open up for Bon Jovi, because in order to save money, this is my joke, in order to save money on opening acts for their last big American tour, they offered opening slots to local artists. Now, they wouldn't pay them. They'd get 20 minutes, but they would get free audio and video. A lot of it was like 1 or 2 cameras, not that great. Now, Natalie Gelman's husband, I believe, works in film. So he actually had a camera behind her to get like wide shots. He was smart. I interviewed her amongst these 7 artists. Story comes out, I stay in touch with her, and she invites me to a house concert that she's doing in Brooklyn. And it was either going to be at City Winery at the house concert. And me at that point was like, if I got a City Winery, it's going to be like, I'm still going to have to buy I'm going to have to buy food and drinks. That's screw it. I'll go to the house concert. It's cheaper, but it's also going to be more intimate. And those are actually more fun. I go there, half the people are there are freelancers and editors. I meet my editor from NBC. A month later, I got hired on my first story. That's great. So not only do I get to see an intimate concert and I still supported the artist. The money actually didn't go to City Winery. It went to her. We all pitched in $20 or whatever it was. And I got a gig. So yes, you do need to go out and meet people. You can't just email people, even chats like this. This is great actually in the time of COVID, but it is important to go somewhere because you never know. I mean, I know I probably emailed with Josh Bernstein before, but I finally met him when he had hosted a Papa Roach event in the city. And then I met him afterwards because I had covered the band, so they walked me back. Somebody at Better Noise walked me back. And so I chatted with a couple of the guys in the band, and I chatted with him, and we stayed in touch. Then I interviewed him for Billboard about his comics thing. Again, this is all how it works. And if you don't get to meet, if the work speaks for itself, then gradually, eventually somebody wants to meet you. I notice as a writer, I'm the one that usually has to do that legwork though. I'm the one that has to go out. But then because of my initiative, that's how people remember me. I go out to LA, I go out to San Francisco, I go out to Chicago. And then when I come back out again, I do that. And then there's some people that I just become friends with, and it's just the excuse to go out to dinner. I'm not that kind of guy. Like if you get laid off from a job, I'm not that kind of guy that's not going to talk to you at that moment. I remember a movie editor I know got laid off from a prestigious gig, and this 2 months later, and this one publicist is like, "Oh, have you heard what's going on with him? Like, who's he working for?" And I was like, It's been a couple months.
Yeah.
I would think if you've worked for him with the for the last 10 years that you can keep sending him product. It's not really a big deal, and he'll figure it out. And he did.
Yeah.
Sometimes, some publicists get a little cold about it. Usually not. I haven't really encountered that, but I think some people get afraid too on both ends. If something bad goes on, they don't want to let people know what's happening. And so they go off the radar. And I'm not that kind of person, which is probably
I
why I know a lot
mean,
of people.
nor am I. You know, I
No.
announced that I, left where I was, and God, the response has been overwhelming. So,
Oh yeah. Well, you've been doing this a long time. I mean, I think the movie business is rougher than the music business. The movie business, they really keep tabs on it. I know someone who's laid off from an editing gig, and all these publicists got him off the list within 2 weeks. I'm like, seriously? And then he gets freelance and he gets another editing gig. I'm like, so why not just keep him on the list? It's just
right.
very strange. Like, cultivate those relationships. I mean, there's some publicists I haven't worked with in years, but suddenly I'm contacting them about something, and we're working together again. And I know you want to have it that you can go to somebody all the time. Sometimes you come to me with things and I can't always do something, but I try, and
Right.
I try. And sometimes I want them to work with someone something and they can't do it. And I don't know. And I think it's about having a sense of humor. I remember one publicist, I forget her name now. This was like 20 years ago. She worked a lot of stoner bands, and it was really clever what she did. She kept a file on all her writers and what their interests are and what they were doing. So when she would call them up, she'd follow up she'd say, "Oh, how's this going? Or how are you doing?" And then I told her, she's like, "You think that's creepy, don't you?" I'm like, actually, I think that's clever, because it means even if you can't remember everything, certain people you actually do care. So when I visited her, we had a very cool time. I haven't seen her in a long time. I don't know if she's still working in music. So that part might be
Mm.
part of it. But you need to find a way to open those doors. I know it's a very busy world we live in. I'm forgetting things more and more. I've had times I've met publicists at Comic-Con, and 2 years later I forget meeting them, which I felt really bad about.
Mm.
But I deal with probably a couple hundred publicists, and if we only had a 2-minute conversation, then we don't email all year.
Yeah.
They remember me, probably because I talk too much, and then I remember them, but I don't. Sometimes, like I talked to a friend of my girlfriend's. I talked to her at my Bon Jovi book party, but I just hadn't remembered off the top of my head, and she was a little surprised. And I said, when I did that party, that was the time I felt like a rock star, because I had 50 people in that room that wanted me to sign their book and have a conversation with
Oh.
me. And now I understand what artists go through at meet and greets, because you have 2 minutes with everybody, and everyone's trying to come in to talk to you. And I can see how people get tired of that. So you have to. And it's the same thing when you're a writer at a meet and greet. You have to pick your moment,
Yeah.
and you have to know when to approach somebody and what to say, because that can make the difference. And sometimes if there's not a meet and greet, you can still sneak in. I learned that. I went to see Blackfield, which is Stephen Wilson from Porcupine Tree, and Aviv
Oh,
Geffen,
yeah.
the Israeli pop star. And there wasn't going to be a meet and greet at Irving Plaza, but I knew that we know that the meet and greet, the VIP area up in the balcony, the door's right there.
Yeah.
So while the bouncer was trying to push people away, they're being annoying, I just stuck my head around the corner. I popped in, and Steve was like, "Hey, Brian, come on in." I just walked in,
Yeah,
and that was
well,
it.
it's you. They know you, and really,
You know,
it's your personal brand, your personal way of doing things.
sure.
And
But you're also good about bonding with people, and
well, I give a
early
shit,
on you
and
were
you
very
give a
nice.
shit. You know.
But early on you were nice to me, and you took me around to a lot of parties where people didn't know me yet. And I think Michelle Ferguson Cohen now. She
Well,
actually
she and
she would
like
invite
you,
me to dinner. She would invite me to dinner parties, and these were not like industry parties. And I
right?
wasn't able to make it a couple of times because I think I had a long distance relationship where there was an event going on. But I appreciated it, and I appreciated some people who would just like, "Yeah, you're cool, whatever." And because I remember once I was hanging out with some friends of mine, and they would party a lot, and I just sat there and I'm like, "This is great. But I don't party like you guys do. Like, I drink, but I like, why? You see, like when I hang out, she's like, "I would just like hanging out with you." I'm like, "Okay." But this industry, I mean, now it's very different. It's a lot more
Yeah,
PC. 20 years ago, it was still, I think, probably more party hardy, at least on the rock side. These
yeah,
days, they hide everything from you. But back then, I think it was a little bit more like that, about staying out all night and going to events. And I like to do that, but I didn't need to be trashed to do it. I didn't actually think that enhanced the experience at all.
right.
But then I used to get drunk at all these DVD parties that people would have, because, like, Disney had a candy and martini party, and you know me. And I
Nice.
actually remember once I went to an X-Men junket, and I told the Fox publicist Toronto, I said, "Yeah, I used to drink a lot at your party." She's like, "Oh yeah, we remember." I was like, "Oh." She said, "Oh no, you're fine, because if you did anything bad, you would not be here right now." But I
Right.
did the same thing. I'm like, "Let's hang out." Like, I wasn't like I'm the big shot writer here. You had a room full of writers who all have egos. I'm like, yeah, like my friend Rick Rhodes from Disney, when he was at Disney, we just chat. We weren't talking about business. We didn't care. But we deal with each other all year long. It was just like, hey, let's hang out. And again, that business, friends thing, I don't know. The friends thing is just organic. You can't,
Well, yeah, and also we had
it is what
expense
it is.
accounts back in the day, which we don't have now. And,
What?
we could take people out.
Yeah. Oh, the
So,
accounts. Yeah, yeah. Well, you invited me to that thing at the Soho House last year, and I mean, you were probably weren't sure I could do anything, but it was fun. I know sometimes too publicists have to invite people,
well,
and you
I
have to
just
be aware
like
that they need help.
to
Like, I
hang
need you at
out
this
with you.
event. Yeah, but sometimes publicists also need you at an event, and maybe you might be busy, but once in a while, do them that favor.
Yeah,
If you're going out somewhere and you can have time to go to that event beforehand, just pop in, make an appearance, because it makes them look good.
yeah.
And there's that give and take. And I know that the one thing I wanted to bring up before, actually, we had only so much time, is that we were talking about the fact that, publicists will complain to me, well, people ask about my big artists, but not my baby bands. And then a lot of writers will say, well, you don't help me with your big artists, but you want me to write about your baby bands. And so there's a little bit of back and forth on that I guess has to be addressed at some point,
Hmm.
where, we have to be communicative about that. And it is harder. I mean, at least on the movie side and probably on music, you have a lot more online outlets to deal with. There's a lot more coverage to get done. And then we have to pitch a lot more than we used to. I mean, I still have people coming to me and asking me to do things, like Discogs does that a lot. But a lot of times these days, you still have to pitch.
Yeah.
And the pitching takes time. And so I can pitch your story, but I might have 3 other pitches. I can't just pitch one thing. So these kind of dialogues, just actually talking to people about what they can do better helps. And
Well, would it help if people did more research on the publication that they want to be in, and maybe come up with a few different choices for angles? Would that be helpful?
well, I remember, here's something funny. I remember my editor at Keyboard, I think it was Greg Rule at the time, he was saying that somebody pitched him on a country artist for keyboard, except there weren't any keyboards on the album. He's like, no, sorry.
Yeah.
It was strange. It was like sort of incongruous. Like they just wanted to get any press that they could. And yeah, you should actually, that's why you go to the freelancers sometimes, because
Yeah.
maybe you're trying to find a way into something, and like maybe the freelancer can't help you, but maybe I can offer you advice. Like if you want to crack this publication, this is what's going to happen. The big problem that exists now is, I remember when I wrote for magazines, print magazines in the 90s and the early aughts, they didn't have page views, unique visitors, because it was print. Then all this web stuff came in, and by about 10 years ago, people are looking at how much traffic something is going to generate. And I got a taste of that in 98 of all places. Remember Wall of Sound, which was a
Yeah.
short-lived music site? So I wrote about Front 242, this pioneering industrial band, and they were
Love
like
that
reuniting
band.
or something. And a big 80s band. And the editor did the story, but then the feedback was it only did about a third of the traffic we normally do. Okay, I get that. But then when everything is based on page views and clicks, then you miss out on an interesting story that maybe over time grows. Ray Roldan set me up with Emily Autumn for my blog, just my blog. And over time, the 2-part interview, they each got 50,000 page views, according to the stats that I had on my site. And I'm like, for a
Wow.
personal blog to get 50,000 page views is a lot.
Yeah.
And that's more than some professional sites. Because I'll tell you, I knew some stats for some sites that had just started their blogs like 8-10 years ago, and they were nowhere near 50,000 for their posts. These
No.
days, the big sites get a lot of traffic, but like when I do something for NBC, I know people read it because
Yeah.
it gets a lot of traction. But and Discogs, I think, does well. But there are some that I was a little shocked at how low the numbers were. So sometimes a personal blog does work. I used to think that people were desperate for press if they came to me at my blog because they knew that was the auxiliary thing. And sometimes I would do it if I had the time. And again, it's the relationships. When we get busier, like if I'm working on a book and I'm working on a book proposal with somebody right now,
Yeah.
sometimes you can't. Whatever. I mean, that's that. I just we could talk about this for hours, probably.
Probably, but we do need to wrap up. Everybody, thank you for joining us, and Brian, thank you
Well,
so
thank you.
much. There was a lot of info packed into that little amount of time,
Oh yeah.
and
Oh,
and
well,
yeah,
we're going to work on something again soon. We already did talk about something,
yes,
so
definitely. And
um,
thank you all, and
indeed.
we will see you next week.
Cool.
Thanks, Brian.
Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Catch you later on. Thanks.